This account was never prepared for publication, review, or circulation. It was written in fragments over many years, revised only to remove excess and preserve accuracy. What follows is not testimony in the formal sense, nor is it confession. It is a record of alignment and correction, set down because omission began to feel less accurate than restraint. I make no claim of authority beyond presence, and no claim of certainty beyond consequence. In 1990, I was assigned to a rural Australian property under conditions that, at the time, appeared routine. There was no expectation of anomaly, no anticipation of incident beyond what my experience already encompassed. I did not arrive with belief, curiosity, or caution shaped by folklore. I arrived with procedure. That distinction matters. What occurred afterward did not depend on expectation. It occurred despite it. The narrative that follows has been arranged not by chronology alone, but by progression of awareness. Events did not escalate through action, but through recognition. Each development altered conditions subtly, often without immediate understanding. Fear, where it appeared, did not precede evidence. It followed implication. Nothing announced itself. Nothing needed to. I have avoided descriptive excess throughout this record. Where detail could not be verified, it was excluded. Where interpretation threatened accuracy, it was withheld. The absence of certain descriptions is deliberate. What mattered was never what was seen, but what was acknowledged without being shown. Language is poorly suited to such things, and I have not attempted to force it into adequacy. This account should not be read as warning, explanation, or proof. It offers none of those functions. It exists only to preserve the shape of an experience that altered conduct without demanding belief. If it is dismissed, that dismissal changes nothing. If it is accepted, acceptance also changes nothing. The outcome remains the same. What follows was never meant to be read in sequence, nor absorbed as narrative. It is a residue of proximity, written only because silence alone no longer preserved accuracy. I leave it intact, incomplete, and largely unremarked, in the hope that it will remain what it has always been, a record of something that required no witness, and yet briefly allowed one. I set this account down in the winter of 1990, not as a confession, but as a record that was never formally requested and never officially archived. The location was a sheep and cattle property in rural New South Wales, several hours inland from the coast, known locally only by the family name attached to its gates. My presence there was not accidental, nor was it driven by rumor or curiosity. I had been assigned to the area following a sequence of unexplained livestock losses that had strained relations between neighboring farms. The land itself was old, cleared decades earlier, bordered by regrowth forest that had never fully surrendered to fences or fire breaks. At the time, the matter was considered routine, another case of predators, trespass, or neglect. No mention was made of legends, stories, or things said around campfires. I arrived with paperwork, equipment, and a timetable. There was no anticipation beyond the expectation of resolving a practical problem. What occurred afterward was not part of that assignment. By 1990, I had already spent over 15 years working rural incidents across multiple states. My experience included livestock theft, feral animal management, bush trespass investigations, and night patrol coordination. I was accustomed to isolation, to long periods without radio contact, and to working among people who trusted observation over theory. I did not entertain folklore, nor did I encourage it in others. Stories of bush creatures were, in my view, products of fatigue, alcohol, or fear misapplied to ordinary threats. I had dismissed such accounts before without consequence. The file that brought me to that farm contained nothing unusual beyond repetition and frustration. Sheep were found dead without clear signs of dogs or foxes, and fences showed damage that did not fit known patterns. My role was to document, advise, and close the matter. I expected cooperation, not complications. I did not expect silence to become the most consistent detail. The first evening passed without incident, though something in the land resisted ordinary sound. Wind moved through the grass, but the usual chorus of insects failed to rise with dusk. Birds retreated earlier than expected, and even the livestock clustered closer to the sheds than habit suggested. I noted this without comment, attributing it to weather or seasonal shift. Still, the absence was complete enough to register. Sound carries differently in open paddocks, and its absence does not. As night settled, the property felt suspended, as though waiting for something that did not announce itself. I slept lightly, more from unfamiliar surroundings than unease. At that point, nothing had occurred that deserved language stronger than odd. Yet the silence returned each evening with precision. The farm owner, Thomas Ridley, was a practical man in his late 50s, hardened by decades of drought and debt. His wife avoided the paddocks after sunset and did not offer explanations when asked. 2 station hands worked the property intermittently, young men who spoke little and watched the tree lean more than the stock. On my second night, one of them mentioned that his grandfather had refused to camp near the southern fence line. He did not elaborate, nor did I ask him to. Another worker left the property without notice after dusk, claiming illness, and did not return. These behaviors were noted, but not interpreted. People react differently to isolation. I reminded myself of that repeatedly. On the third morning, we found tracks near a collapsed section of fence that did not match any animal I knew. They were large, unevenly spaced, and pressed deep into the dry soil as though made under significant weight. There were no claw marks, no dragging impressions, and no pattern consistent with hooves. The prints began and ended without transition, appearing only in a narrow stretch before vanishing into hardened ground. I photographed them, measured them, and recorded the location. No one suggested what they belonged to. The absence of speculation unsettled me more than the prints themselves. Evidence usually invites explanation. This did not. Against my better judgment, I agreed to conduct a night survey along the southern boundary. The decision was practical on paper, but flawed in retrospect. Visibility was limited, and radio contact was unreliable beyond the main sheds. I believed proximity would yield clarity. Instead, it reduced our margin for withdrawal. At approximately midnight, we heard movement beyond the tree lean, slow and deliberate, pacing rather than passing. No animal revealed itself. The sound adjusted when we stopped, resumed when we moved. It did not rush. It did not retreat. I never saw it directly, and I will not attempt to describe what I did not witness. What I observed was space responding to presence. Shadows shifted without source. Fences vibrated without wind. Something crossed open ground without breaking stride, visible only as a distortion against starlight. It remained just beyond clarity, as though withholding itself. The realization was not that something was there, but that it was aware of us being there. That awareness settled heavily, without urgency. From that point onward, the nights belonged to something else. Sounds began where we were not looking. The entity, whatever it was, demonstrated patience beyond instinct. It waited for isolation, for routine, for mistakes. One of the station hands failed to return from a boundary check before dawn. There were no signs of struggle, no blood, no tracks leading away. Only his torch lay on the ground, unbroken, switched off. The absence that followed was final. The property was abandoned within the week. Officially, the loss was attributed to misadventure. Unofficially, the land was avoided. Fences were left unrepaired. Stock was relocated. Files were closed without resolution. I submitted my report stripped of interpretation, knowing it would be archived unread. The Ridleys sold the land at a loss and did not speak of it again. Years later, I still wake to the sensation of being observed without threat. The memory has no shape, only weight. I never claimed to know what returned to that farm in 1990. I only know it recognized us, and that recognition was enough. I remained in the district for several days after the property was vacated, not out of duty, but because departure required authorization that arrived slowly. The official explanation satisfied paperwork, yet the land itself resisted closure. Roads leading toward the southern boundary showed signs of recent use despite no residents remaining. Gates were found open that had been locked the previous evening. Each morning presented minor changes that implied presence without confirmation. I documented these occurrences with the same restraint as before, though my confidence had begun to erode. It was not fear that unsettled me, but continuity. Whatever had been there had not left with the people. The property no longer belonged to human schedules. It kept its own. At first, I attributed the disturbances to looters or transients, but their patterns lacked haste. No tools were taken. No structures were entered. Footprints appeared near water sources and vanished again without crossing tracks. Fires were not lit. Food was untouched. The activity suggested observation rather than use. I began to feel that the land was being checked, not occupied. This interpretation came without reasoned analysis, arriving instead as a quiet conclusion I did not record. My role demanded neutrality, yet neutrality requires distance, and distance was no longer possible. Each night, the silence returned precisely as before. Insects ceased. Wind softened. The dark arranged itself. On the fifth night after abandonment, I stationed myself near the main shed with a clear view of the southern paddock. The moon provided enough light to read terrain without artificial aid. I waited without movement, determined to confirm whether the disturbances were human. Time passed without incident. Then the fence line began to sway, not from force, but as though brushed repeatedly by something passing alongside it. The motion progressed steadily, never breaking rhythm. I could hear no footsteps, only the faint vibration of wire responding to proximity. The movement stopped when it reached the paddock's midpoint. I did not approach. What followed was an interval I struggled to quantify. Minutes extended without sound or motion. Then, from the far tree line, a low resonance emerged, not a call, not a warning, but something measured. It was produced once, then repeated after a long pause. The sound was not loud, yet it carried across the field with clarity. It did not resemble any animal vocalization I knew. More unsettling was its placement. It came from exactly where the missing station hand had last been seen. I noted the coincidence without assigning meaning, though meaning pressed itself forward regardless. I began to understand that whatever lingered there did not act impulsively. It responded to conditions. When I remained still, it did the same. When I moved, the sound shifted position, maintaining distance while preserving alignment. It mirrored awareness, not aggression. This realization altered my behavior more than any overt threat could have. I ceased patrols. I avoided predictable routines. I slept irregularly. Yet even in avoidance, patterns form. The land noticed these as well. The sixth morning brought physical confirmation that no human explanation could contain. Near the shed where I had stood, the earth showed impressions too deep for soil that had not been disturbed by rain. They were not tracks in sequence, but marks placed deliberately, as though testing weight. Each depression was spaced at equal intervals, forming a line that stopped short of the building. No approach marks preceded them. No departure marks followed. It was as if the ground itself had been pressed downward from above. I photographed them, though the images later failed to capture depth accurately. By then, communication from headquarters had slowed to formality. My reports received acknowledgement without inquiry. I sensed reluctance rather than disbelief. It was easier for the matter to remain unresolved. On the seventh night, the sound returned, closer this time, no longer confined to the tree line. It did not repeat its earlier resonance. Instead, it produced a single, controlled exhalation that carried the impression of restraint. I felt then, without evidence, that it had been waiting for my attention. That knowledge settled without panic, heavy and final. I did not see it, but I became aware of its position through absence. Space directly ahead of me felt occupied despite remaining visually unchanged. The air pressed differently. My breathing felt noticed. I resisted the urge to retreat, knowing sudden movement would invite response. The silence that followed was complete, heavier than any sound. It lasted long enough for resolve to fail quietly. When I finally withdrew, the pressure lifted, as though permission had been granted. The following day, authorization arrived to leave the district. I complied without delay. No effort was made to secure the property. It was struck from active consideration and listed as unsuitable for reassignment. Years later, maps would show the land unchanged, yet no one would claim it. I never returned. I did not need to. Some places do not require presence to remain known. I did not depart the district immediately after receiving authorization, despite the urgency implied in the message. Administrative processes required the transfer of records and equipment, tasks that demanded one final night near the property. I chose to camp at a roadside clearing several kilometers away, far enough to avoid proximity yet close enough to maintain oversight. The decision was practical, but it carried an unspoken motive. I wanted distance without severance. Leaving entirely felt premature, as though the matter would persist unresolved if not observed once more. I convinced myself that separation would restore perspective. It did not. That night, the silence extended beyond the boundaries of the farm. Even at the clearing, natural sound diminished earlier than expected. The forest line opposite my position absorbed light without reflection, appearing deeper than its physical depth should have allowed. I noted this as fatigue-induced distortion and recorded it as such. Still, my attention returned repeatedly to the road behind me, not because of noise, but because of the sense that alignment had shifted. I felt oriented toward something I could not see, as though my position had been factored into a larger arrangement. Sleep came briefly and without rest. Near dawn, I was woken by the sound of movement along the gravel road. It was unhurried, rhythmic, and ceased when I became fully alert. No vehicle approached. No figure emerged. The road returned to stillness, yet the impression of passage remained, like warmth lingering after contact. I remained seated in the vehicle until daylight, unwilling to step out while visibility remained uncertain. When light finally settled, the road showed no tracks, no displaced stones, no sign of use. The absence was exact, not careless. Whatever had moved had done so without leaving evidence behind. I returned to the farm perimeter later that morning under the pretense of final inspection. The land appeared unchanged, yet something fundamental had altered. The paddocks felt compressed, distances shortened. The southern fence line leaned inward, though inspection showed no structural failure. I experienced a persistent sense of being measured, not visually, but spatially. My movements felt accounted for before completion. This perception did not produce panic. Instead, it imposed caution. I avoided open ground and remained near the vehicle, aware that visibility favored something other than myself. At the site where the station hand had vanished, I found an object I had not noticed before. His notebook lay partially embedded in the soil, pages intact, unmarked by weather. The placement suggested intention rather than loss. It was not hidden, yet not immediately visible. I retrieved it carefully, expecting signs of struggle or distress. There were none. The final entry recorded routine observations, ending mid-sentence without explanation. The handwriting did not waver. The calmness of the writing unsettled me more than fear would have. As I stood there, the air shifted. Not abruptly, but as though pressure redistributed around a central point behind me. I did not turn immediately. Experience had taught me that sudden reaction often precedes escalation. Instead, I focused on sound. There was none. Yet I became aware of depth where none should exist, a sense that the space beyond the tree line had expanded inward. I felt observed without hostility, evaluated rather than threatened. The awareness was precise enough to suggest recognition. I was no longer simply present. I was accounted for. I withdrew slowly, maintaining alignment with the open ground, refusing to break visual contact with the empty field. When I reached the vehicle, the sensation eased, not dissipating entirely, but loosening. I understood then that proximity governed response. Distance was permitted. Encroachment was noted. The entity, whatever it was, enforced boundaries without overt action. It allowed movement away. It did not pursue. This restraint was more unsettling than aggression could have been. The remainder of the day passed without incident, yet my departure felt conditional. I sensed that leaving was not an escape, but a conclusion agreed upon by only one side. When I drove away, I did not look back. I knew that confirmation was unnecessary. The land had not been abandoned in the way humans abandon places. It had been reclaimed quietly, without announcement. In the years that followed, I reviewed that notebook repeatedly, searching for signs I might have missed. The pages never yielded further meaning. The calmness of the final entry remained unchanged, immune to reinterpretation. I came to understand that the absence of panic was not coincidence. It was allowance. Whatever returned to that farm in 1990 did not need to frighten those it removed. It only needed them to stop being there. After leaving the district, I submitted myself to routine reassignment, expecting the familiar dulling effect of distance and time. Instead, the incident followed me in subtler ways. Not as memory, but as alteration. I found that my awareness of space had changed, that I noticed margins more than objects. Rooms felt occupied before being entered. Silence carried implication rather than absence. I attributed this to fatigue and did not record it. To do so would have invited questions I had no intention of answering. Some records are best kept privately. Several months later, I was asked, informally, to review a separate matter involving unexplained livestock behavior 200 kilometers north of the original site. The request was casual, framed as a consultation rather than an assignment. I declined without explanation. The reaction to my refusal was immediate acceptance, as though it had been anticipated. That, more than the request itself, confirmed that the earlier report had not gone unread. It had merely been understood in a way that did not require response. Silence, I learned, can function as acknowledgement. The first letter arrived the following year. It bore no return address and referenced no names. Inside was a single page torn from a ledger, containing a crude map drawn in pencil. The terrain resembled the southern paddock of the abandoned farm, though altered slightly, as if remembered imperfectly. A single mark indicated a point beyond the tree line. There was no message. I destroyed the letter without reply. I told myself it was coincidence or provocation. Yet coincidence does not select its recipients so precisely. Over time, similar communications arrived intermittently. Always incomplete. Always indirect. None demanded action. They simply reminded. I stopped opening them and began disposing of them unopened. This did not stop their arrival. What changed was my reaction. I felt no urgency, no fear. Only the steady awareness that my involvement had not ended with departure. I had been included, not pursued. That distinction mattered. It suggested choice on the part of whatever had taken notice. I avoided rural postings after that, favoring administrative roles that kept me within populated boundaries. Yet even in urban settings, there were moments when sound withdrew abruptly, leaving the same dense quiet I had known before. These moments never lasted long. They did not escalate. They merely occurred, as if confirming continuity. I never spoke of them. Language felt inadequate and unnecessary. Some experiences resist narrative because they are not meant to be shared. Years later, I learned that the abandoned property had been quietly reclassified. No public notice accompanied the decision. Survey markers were removed. Access roads fell into disrepair without official cause. The land did not return to forest, nor was it developed. It remained as it had been, held in suspension. I understood then that erasure can be procedural rather than physical. A place can be removed from consideration without being destroyed. The final correspondence arrived on the 10th anniversary of my departure. It contained no paper, only a pressed fragment of wire, bent into a shape that mirrored the fence damage I had first documented. The metal showed no rust, though it should have. I did not keep it. I did not destroy it either. I returned it to the ground at the edge of a different forest, one unconnected to the original site. That night, for the first time in years, the silence lifted. I have lived with the understanding that some encounters are not meant to resolve. They are acknowledgments, exchanges of awareness rather than conflict. I never claimed certainty, and I never sought explanation. What occurred in 1990 was not an invasion, nor a haunting. It was a return, timed precisely to be noticed and then allowed to continue unseen. I record this now only because distance has finally become possible, though not complete. The land did not follow me. It did not need to. It only needed to know that I remembered where the boundary was drawn. In the years that followed, my professional life resumed its former shape, though my relationship with routine had changed. I carried out assignments efficiently, avoided unnecessary exposure, and limited my movements to what was required. Colleagues remarked on my caution, mistaking it for age or experience. I did not correct them. What I had learned could not be transferred without distortion. Awareness is not instruction. It arrives on its own terms, and it cannot be hurried or imposed. There were occasions when reports crossed my desk that echoed familiar patterns. Livestock refusing certain paddocks. Dogs unwilling to range beyond a fence line. Isolated properties where sound diminished without cause. These accounts were never identical, nor were they close enough to justify connection. I treated them as separate matters and declined involvement where possible. The restraint felt necessary, as though further proximity would invite recognition again. I had no desire to test whether awareness persisted across distance. Some thresholds, once crossed, should not be approached deliberately. I noticed, however, that avoidance did not guarantee separation. During one inspection in a dry interior region, I experienced a sudden withdrawal of sound identical to what I had known before. It lasted only seconds, then released. No visual anomaly followed. No physical evidence remained. Yet the sensation was unmistakable. It was not presence, but confirmation. A reminder that certain forms of attention do not depend on location. They depend on memory, and memory creates alignment whether intended or not. Sleep became irregular during that period. Not because of dreams, but because of intervals of wakefulness where I felt positioned rather than awake. I would lie still, aware of my own breathing, sensing space beyond the walls of my room without picturing it. These moments carried no fear. They were marked instead by restraint, as though something chose not to advance further. That choice, repeated over time, reinforced a pattern. Whatever awareness existed did not seek escalation. It observed continuity and accepted distance. I attempted once to articulate this experience in writing, framing it as stress-related perception. The draft was abandoned before completion. The language failed to remain accurate. It leaned toward explanation, and explanation was not appropriate. The incident did not demand understanding. It demanded acknowledgement. To explain it would have been to diminish it, to render it ordinary. I chose silence instead, allowing the account to remain incomplete, as it had always been. Information reached me indirectly that the Ridley property had been entered briefly by unauthorized parties years after its abandonment. The individuals involved did not remain long. Their statements were inconsistent, lacking detail, and marked by reluctance. No charges were pursued. The land returned to disuse without incident. This outcome did not surprise me. Curiosity fades quickly when it encounters recognition. Not all places welcome observation. Some endure it only briefly, then close themselves again. As time passed, my certainty about what had occurred did not increase. If anything, it diminished. Details softened at the edges, leaving only impressions intact. Yet the core understanding remained unchanged. Something had returned to that land in 1990, not violently, not urgently, but deliberately. It did not seek confrontation. It sought acknowledgement of its presence and its boundary. Once that was achieved, it withdrew from interaction without leaving. I have often considered whether my continued awareness serves any purpose. Perhaps it does not. Perhaps it is merely residue, a consequence of proximity that never fully dissipates. I do not believe the experience marked me as special. It marked me as present at the wrong moment, attentive when attention was reciprocated. That exchange required no further action. It was complete in itself. I continue to live with the understanding that some returns are not meant to be witnessed more than once. They are not warnings or lessons. They are confirmations that certain things endure beyond notice, beyond belief. When they choose to be seen, it is not for explanation, but for recognition. And recognition, once granted, cannot be taken back. I retired from field duty in the late 1990s, officially due to age and accumulated service, unofficially because my superiors preferred that certain reports remain associated with a past that could be categorized as concluded. I accepted the transition without protest. Distance, both administrative and geographic, felt appropriate. I moved to a coastal town where land gives way to water and boundaries are more easily understood. Forests do not approach the sea in the same manner. The horizon is open, and silence behaves differently there. For several years, the incident receded into something resembling memory rather than presence. I no longer felt oriented toward unseen alignments. The abrupt withdrawal of sound became rare. When it did occur, I dismissed it as weather or fatigue. Time diluted precision, and with dilution came a measure of relief. I believed the matter had finally resolved itself into the past, where it belonged. I believed this without certainty, but certainty was never part of the experience. The first indication of recurrence was not dramatic. It was a letter addressed in handwriting I did not recognize, containing no message, only a photograph. The image depicted a stretch of fencing in tall grass, sunlight casting long shadows across disturbed soil. There was no identifying mark, no date, no location. Yet the configuration of wire and post placement was identical to the Ridley property. The soil bore impressions that suggested deliberate pressure rather than passage. I did not know how the sender knew I would recognize it. That knowledge itself implied continuity. I attempted to trace the origin of the photograph through informal channels. The paper stock was common. The processing method suggested a small rural laboratory, not a city service. No fingerprints were recoverable. The envelope contained no traceable fibers. The effort yielded nothing, which in itself felt intentional. Someone had wanted the image delivered, not discovered. I did not respond. Silence had served adequately before. In the months that followed, I began to notice changes in my surroundings that mirrored earlier patterns. Birds avoided the stand of trees behind my house after dusk. Dogs in the neighborhood refused to walk near a particular drainage reserve. Insects ceased their usual chorus at irregular intervals, sometimes for minutes, sometimes for hours. None of these events escalated. None demanded interpretation. Yet their alignment with my own periods of wakefulness was precise enough to suggest correlation. I recorded none of this officially. One evening, while walking near the reserve, I encountered a section of ground that felt compressed beneath my steps, as though recently disturbed yet showing no visible marks. The soil yielded and then resisted, forming shallow depressions that did not match my weight distribution. I stood still for several minutes, observing how the air behaved above the ground. It felt occupied, as though space itself carried mass. I did not remain. I understood then that the phenomenon was not confined to a single property or time. It was not attached to location. It was attached to recognition. I began to consider that the original incident may have been less an encounter and more an acknowledgement of overlap. Certain regions, at certain times, become visible to those who are attentive. Once noticed, the overlap does not vanish entirely. It recedes, but it remains capable of aligning again when conditions permit. This interpretation offered no comfort, only structure. Structure is preferable to chaos, even when structure implies persistence. The next correspondence arrived as a parcel containing a small object, a fragment of wood with wire embedded, bent in the same unnatural angle I had documented years earlier. The wood was old, weathered, yet the break appeared recent. There was no accompanying note. I did not preserve the object. I returned it to the drainage reserve and left it partially buried. The following night, the insects returned in full force for the first time in weeks. The correlation was too precise to ignore, yet I refrained from assigning agency. Agency was implied by pattern, not proven by evidence. Sleep became again an interval of awareness rather than rest. I found myself listening for changes in spatial pressure rather than sound. I noticed when darkness felt structured, when shadows seemed arranged rather than incidental. These perceptions did not produce fear. They produced a steady vigilance, the kind one maintains when aware that observation is mutual. I did not feel threatened. I felt catalogued. I came to believe that the entity, or whatever term inadequately approximates it, does not persist in a single form or location. It persists as a boundary condition. When human attention aligns with its domain, it becomes perceptible. When attention withdraws, it resumes its own continuity. Violence is unnecessary for such a system. Removal of presence is sufficient. Silence, disappearance, and abandonment achieve the same outcome more efficiently. I have never attempted to provoke further contact. Curiosity does not outweigh recognition of asymmetry. Whatever returned to that Australian farm in 1990 did not require belief, description, or validation. It required only acknowledgement that it was present and that we were not intended to remain. Once that acknowledgement occurred, events unfolded with minimal intervention. I continue to receive no further communications. That in itself may be the final confirmation. Attention, once registered, does not require repetition. It only requires that memory persists, maintaining the boundary without physical enforcement. In that sense, the incident has never concluded. It has merely been archived in the only place where such matters can persist without consequence, within a single witness who understands that witnessing was the entire purpose. As the years advanced, the intervals between disturbances lengthened, though they never vanished entirely. What changed was my perception of their function. They no longer felt like reminders meant for me alone, but confirmations that a balance remained intact. I understood that awareness, once established, does not demand constant reinforcement. It settles into background conditions, shaping behavior quietly. I adjusted my life accordingly, avoiding unnecessary proximity to undeveloped land and declining invitations that would place me in prolonged isolation. These choices were not driven by fear, but by respect for limits that had been clearly demonstrated. On rare occasions, I encountered others who carried a similar restraint, though we never spoke of its origin. Farmers who refused to cross certain boundaries at night. Rangers who altered patrol routes without explanation. Older residents who paused before naming places, choosing silence instead. There was no shared language for this understanding, only shared avoidance. I recognized it immediately and did not question it. Recognition, I learned, does not require disclosure. It is enough to notice when someone else has already noticed. During one such encounter, an elderly man mentioned the Ridley property in passing, referring to it only as that ground that doesn't keep people. He did not elaborate, nor did he need to. The phrasing carried precision without detail. It implied continuity beyond individual memory. I realized then that the 1990 incident was not singular. It was one instance within a sequence spaced far enough apart to resist pattern recognition. The entity did not return frequently. It returned only when conditions aligned. That alignment did not depend on provocation. It depended on presence. I reflected often on the missing station hand, not with guilt, but with unresolved attention. His disappearance had occurred without spectacle, without struggle, without aftermath. It was the most efficient outcome possible. I came to understand that violence would have introduced complication. Removal without trace preserved balance. That restraint suggested intention rather than instinct. Whatever intelligence governed the event understood consequence and minimized it. This realization did not comfort me. It clarified the nature of what we had encountered. There were nights when I sensed alignment briefly, a narrowing of space that suggested overlap. These moments were fleeting and did not escalate. I remained still during them, allowing them to pass without response. Stillness, I learned, was interpreted as acknowledgement without challenge. Movement invited recalibration. I chose stillness whenever possible. The moments ended quietly, leaving no residue beyond awareness. I never attempted to document these later occurrences. Documentation implies transmission, and transmission was not appropriate. The original account itself was an exception, written only because the incident resisted complete internalization. Even now, I am aware that recording it risks alteration. Language simplifies. It assigns sequence where experience provided continuity. Yet I persist, not to explain, but to preserve accuracy as best as language allows. What struck me most over time was the absence of pursuit. The entity did not follow, did not intrude, did not seek to expand its domain. It enforced boundaries only when necessary and withdrew when compliance was achieved. This behavior suggested a system older than conflict, one refined through repetition rather than adaptation. Humans were not adversaries within this system. We were variables, occasionally misaligned, corrected through minimal intervention. I came to accept that the fear associated with such encounters arises not from threat, but from recognition of irrelevance. Violence grants significance. Removal without acknowledgement does not. The station hand had not been punished. He had been excluded. That distinction altered how I understood loss. It was not personal. It was procedural. This understanding carried a weight that never fully lifted. In later years, I avoided discussions of legends and folklore not out of skepticism, but out of recognition that such frameworks distort rather than clarify. What we encountered did not belong to narrative tradition. It did not seek to be remembered as story. It sought only to maintain separation. Stories invite repetition. Separation requires silence. I honored that silence whenever possible. I now believe that the return in 1990 occurred because conditions briefly allowed it to be perceived, not because it required action. The land, the people, and the moment aligned just long enough for awareness to surface. Once that awareness was established, continuation became unnecessary. The system corrected itself. We left. It remained. That was the entire exchange. I continue to live within boundaries that were never formally drawn yet remain unmistakable. I do not feel watched in the conventional sense. I feel accounted for, as one might feel acknowledged by something that does not require interaction. This state carries no urgency. It carries permanence. And permanence, once recognized, alters behavior without further instruction. There came a point when memory no longer behaved as recollection, but as orientation. I did not think back to the farm deliberately, rather, my thoughts adjusted around it, as though the incident had become a fixed reference point. Decisions were measured against it without conscious effort. Routes were chosen, places avoided, silences noted. The event no longer needed to be recalled to exert influence. It existed as a condition rather than a narrative. I noticed this most clearly when I was asked, many years later, to give an informal lecture on rural incident assessment to a small group of trainees. The material was familiar, procedural, and unremarkable. Yet when discussion turned to unexplained losses and environmental anomalies, I found myself omitting entire categories of observation. I spoke only of what could be closed, resolved, or transferred. I avoided describing situations that resist conclusion. Not because they were rare, but because they require a different response than investigation. I realized then that my professional instincts had changed permanently. One trainee asked whether there were cases that should simply be left alone. The question was framed hypothetically, almost casually. I paused longer than expected before answering. I said only that some sites do not respond well to sustained attention, and that escalation often begins with insistence. The group accepted this without challenge. I did not expand. Expansion would have been inaccurate. The truth was not that such sites should be avoided, but that they should be recognized quickly and disengaged from without ceremony. In the years following that lecture, I became aware of how often people mistake persistence for diligence. The incident in 1990 had demonstrated the opposite. Persistence invites response. Withdrawal invites stability. The entity had not acted until patterns repeated, until presence became predictable. Once predictability was established, correction followed. The correction was not dramatic. It was efficient. That efficiency remained the most disturbing aspect of the encounter. Occasionally, I reviewed official records related to the region, now heavily redacted and fragmented. Dates had been altered slightly. Descriptions softened. Language became deliberately imprecise. It was clear that multiple hands had adjusted the archive over time, not to conceal a single event, but to blur a pattern. This was not a conspiracy in the theatrical sense. It was administrative instinct. Systems resist anomalies that cannot be categorized. They smooth edges until nothing remains sharp enough to demand attention. I wondered then how many similar sites existed, managed not by secrecy, but by attrition. Places gradually emptied, reassigned, or forgotten until their absence felt natural. No warnings posted. No explanations offered. Only subtle discouragement reinforced by inconvenience. Over time, even memory loosens its hold. The land remains, but human presence thins until overlap no longer occurs. This method requires patience, something the entity had demonstrated in abundance. There were moments, rare and brief, when I sensed alignment again, usually in transitional spaces where boundaries are less defined. The edge of a clearing. A service road unused at night. A fence line no longer maintained. In these moments, I felt the same spatial pressure I had known before, never advancing, never retreating. It was enough to confirm that the condition persisted. I did not linger. Lingering was unnecessary. I began to understand that the entity's intelligence was not expressed through strategy or adaptation, but through consistency. It did not need to learn. It applied the same response each time conditions required it. Humans, by contrast, forget, reinterpret, and repeat. That imbalance explains why encounters recur across generations without accumulation of knowledge. Each instance feels isolated because memory is not shared in the correct form. Stories fail. Records erode. Only behavior persists. As I aged, I found comfort in predictability rather than explanation. The incident had taught me that not all unknowns expand. Some remain fixed, content to exist without acknowledgement. They surface only when disturbed by sustained attention. Once attention withdraws, they return to continuity. This understanding removed the urgency that fear often brings. Fear seeks resolution. Recognition accepts coexistence. I have not returned to the region, nor have I sought confirmation that the land remains untouched. confirmation would serve no purpose. The absence of further incident is itself sufficient evidence. Stability does not announce itself. It simply continues. The system, once corrected, does not require monitoring. What remains with me is not dread, but clarity. The night the Yowie returned was not marked by violence or revelation. It was marked by recognition, ours of it, and its of us. That mutual awareness altered behavior on one side only. The other had no need to change. The permanent loss did not arrive with spectacle. It unfolded quietly, without urgency, and only later revealed itself as irreversible. At the time, I did not recognize it as loss at all. I believed I had merely adjusted, that my caution was temporary and would recede with age. It was only after several years had passed that I understood something essential had been removed. The capacity to assume safety by default was gone. In its place remained a conditional awareness that never fully disengaged. I discovered this absence most clearly during moments that should have felt unremarkable. Walking alone at dusk. Standing at the edge of open land. Hearing silence settle where sound should have continued. Where others experienced neutrality, I experienced assessment. I could no longer occupy space without sensing whether that occupation was tolerated. This did not produce fear. It produced restraint. I became a guest everywhere, even in places meant for public use. Relationships shifted as a result. I found it difficult to explain why I avoided certain environments, why I declined invitations that involved remoteness or extended isolation. Explanations felt inadequate and dishonest. To say I was afraid would have been inaccurate. I was not afraid of harm. I was aware of removal. That distinction has no place in ordinary conversation. It isolates the one who understands it. Gradually, I withdrew from contexts that demanded explanation. The loss extended into sleep. Dreams did not feature the land or any figure associated with it. Instead, they were marked by thresholds I could not cross. Doors without handles. Paths that narrowed until movement became impossible. These dreams carried no terror. They ended quietly, without resolution. I would wake with the same understanding that had followed the incident itself: some boundaries exist without negotiation. Awareness of them is not meant to empower. It is meant to constrain. I learned, too, that once this awareness takes hold, it cannot be transferred. Attempts to describe it reduce it to metaphor or superstition. Those who listen hear only story, not condition. They search for images where none were ever fully present. They expect conflict, climax, explanation. What they receive instead is silence, and silence is easily dismissed. This is why the knowledge does not spread. It cannot survive retelling. It survives only in behavior. The station hand's disappearance returned to me often during this period, not as an image, but as an absence that mirrored my own internal shift. He had not been taken violently. He had been removed cleanly, efficiently, without residue. In a way I could not articulate, I understood that I had undergone a lesser version of the same process. Something had been subtracted. I remained functional, intact, but altered. The difference lay in degree, not kind. This understanding did not lead me to despair. It led me to acceptance. Loss does not always demand mourning. Sometimes it demands adjustment. I adjusted by limiting my footprint, by respecting spaces that felt compressed or resistant, by withdrawing when silence deepened without cause. These behaviors became automatic. They required no conscious decision. My life narrowed slightly, but it also stabilized. I encountered no further escalation. There were moments when I wondered whether the entity was aware of this change in me, whether recognition had altered me in a way that remained perceptible. I dismissed the question as unnecessary. Awareness does not require reciprocity. It requires only acknowledgement. That acknowledgement had been granted long ago. Whatever balance existed did not depend on my continued attention. It depended on my compliance, which had been achieved. I came to understand that the irreversible consequence of the night the Yowie returned was not death alone, nor abandonment of land. It was the quiet removal of certainty. Once removed, certainty does not regenerate. It leaves behind caution that feels like wisdom and restraint that resembles choice. Others might call this aging. I know it is not. It began too precisely, too completely. I live now with the knowledge that some losses cannot be pointed to, only lived around. They leave no mark that can be shown, only absences that shape behavior. The land took one man entirely. It took from me something smaller, but permanent. And that was sufficient. The withdrawal did not occur all at once, nor was it announced. It manifested as a gradual thinning of connection, a quiet retreat from spaces that no longer invited presence. By the time I recognized it as abandonment, the process was already complete. The farm itself had long since slipped from public consciousness, but so too had my place within the kind of work that brought me there. I was no longer suited to environments where persistence was mistaken for resolution. I understood too clearly when to leave. Officially, the Ridley property ceased to exist as a point of concern. It appeared on no new surveys, generated no inquiries, and attracted no interest. Roads leading toward it deteriorated without repair. Signage was removed and never replaced. Maps rendered it as unremarkable terrain, indistinguishable from surrounding land. This erasure was not coordinated. It was the cumulative effect of neglect applied evenly over time. No one was instructed to forget. Forgetting simply became convenient. I learned through secondary sources that the remaining structures eventually collapsed under weather and disuse. No effort was made to salvage materials. No historical record was preserved. When asked casually about the site, locals spoke vaguely or changed the subject. The land did not acquire a reputation. It acquired absence. That, I believe, was intentional, not by human design, but by alignment with a condition that discourages attention. Places that resist notice often succeed without resistance. My own withdrawal mirrored this process. I reduced correspondence, declined advisory roles, and allowed professional relationships to lapse without explanation. This was not isolation born of bitterness. It was a recalibration of engagement. I no longer wished to be present where presence itself might become a factor. The incident had demonstrated that attention alters conditions. Withdrawal restores them. I chose restoration wherever possible. There were moments when this retreat felt like failure. A sense that I had abandoned responsibility rather than fulfilled it. Yet responsibility implies agency, and agency was never part of the exchange. The entity had not negotiated. It had not demanded understanding. It had simply enforced a boundary. My continued involvement would not have honored that boundary. It would have tested it. Testing had already proven unnecessary. I noticed, over time, that my absence from certain contexts improved outcomes. Others filled roles I had vacated without incident. Investigations proceeded without complication. No further disappearances were linked to my former areas of oversight. This did not mean the underlying conditions had changed. It meant alignment had been restored. The system functioned smoothly when not observed too closely. I took a measure of comfort in that. The concept of abandonment carries moral weight, but not all abandonment is neglect. Some forms are corrective. The land had been abandoned by people because it no longer accommodated them. I abandoned certain aspects of my life for the same reason. This parallel did not escape me. It suggested that the incident's influence extended beyond location into pattern. Recognition alters behavior across scales. In quiet moments, I considered whether the entity experienced withdrawal as loss or simply as restoration. The question had no answer, and I did not pursue it. Human concepts of attachment do not translate well to systems that operate on patience rather than desire. Whatever returned did not linger out of need. It lingered until conditions no longer required its presence. Then it remained without interaction, which may have been its default state all along. The abandonment was mutual, though asymmetrical. We left because we could not remain. It remained because it did not need to leave. That imbalance defined the encounter more clearly than any physical detail could have. Power did not manifest through action, but through indifference to consequence. Nothing pursued us. Nothing warned us. We were simply no longer included. I have come to accept that some sites, once reclaimed, do not benefit from continued memory. Memory draws attention. Attention invites overlap. Overlap necessitates correction. The most stable outcome is quiet disuse. That is what the farm became, and what parts of my own life also became. This parallel no longer troubles me. It feels appropriate. The night the Yowie returned did not end with confrontation or escape. It ended with withdrawal, slow, procedural, and complete. Everything that followed was merely the extension of that withdrawal into time. The human aftermath did not resolve into a single emotion or lesson. It dispersed into habits, preferences, and refusals that accumulated quietly over time. I did not become fearful in the way such accounts often suggest. I did not expect danger around every corner. What changed was subtler. I lost the ability to treat space as neutral. Every location carried potential conditions, and I learned to read them instinctively. This skill was not useful in most contexts, and it did not make life easier. It made it narrower. I found that conversation itself became a kind of boundary. There were subjects I avoided not because they were painful, but because they encouraged speculation. Speculation invites misalignment. People seek patterns and explanations, hoping to make the unknown manageable. I learned that management was not always the correct response. Sometimes the correct response was to stop asking and step back. This position isolated me socially in ways that were difficult to explain. Silence, again, proved more accurate than speech. There were periods when I attempted to resume a more ordinary engagement with the world. I traveled, accepted invitations, and visited rural areas under controlled circumstances. These efforts were not punished. Nothing intervened. Yet the sense of conditional presence never lifted. I felt tolerated rather than welcomed in certain environments, particularly those marked by long disuse or subtle neglect. The feeling was not oppressive. It was precise. It suggested that tolerance could be withdrawn without warning if limits were crossed. I noticed that others sometimes sensed this as well, though they lacked language for it. They would comment on discomfort, restlessness, or an urge to leave without reason. I did not validate these impressions openly. Validation would have encouraged attention. Instead, I supported departure. Leaving early prevented escalation. Over time, I became known among acquaintances as someone who preferred to move on before events concluded. They interpreted this as impatience. It was, in fact, compliance. The psychological impact of the incident never manifested as distress. It manifested as vigilance without anxiety. I did not relive the night. I did not imagine outcomes. I simply remained aware of alignment and misalignment. This awareness functioned continuously, without effort. It did not interfere with daily tasks, but it altered priorities. I valued predictability over novelty. I favored environments that absorbed sound rather than amplified it. I avoided thresholds at dusk. I came to understand that what had been taken from me was not peace, but innocence of assumption. I could no longer assume that all spaces were intended for human use, or that use implied permission. This understanding does not erode quality of life in obvious ways. It erodes it quietly, by removing spontaneity. Every decision becomes filtered through an unspoken assessment. Most people never perform this assessment. I perform it constantly. There were moments when I considered whether this awareness might fade entirely with time. It did not. Instead, it stabilized, becoming part of my internal landscape. I no longer resisted it. Resistance would have required energy, and energy draws attention. Acceptance required less. Acceptance allowed the condition to remain dormant, influencing behavior without demanding focus. I did not seek therapy or counsel for this state. To do so would have required framing it as dysfunction, and it was not dysfunctional. It was adaptive. The adaptation did not make me safer in a conventional sense. It made me less likely to intrude. That distinction matters. Safety implies protection. I was not protected. I was permitted. As years passed, I realized that the most significant consequence of the night the Yowie returned was not fear, loss, or trauma. It was the permanent alteration of how I relate to the world. I no longer move through it assuming primacy. I move through it as one presence among others, some visible, some not, all governed by boundaries that predate explanation. This account remains unfinished in the only way that matters. There is no closure to offer, no resolution to describe. The aftermath is ongoing, expressed not through memory but through conduct. I live differently because of one night in 1990, not because of what I saw, but because of what I understood without being told. I write this final portion without expectation that it will be read in sequence or understood as conclusion. The account was never meant to resolve. It exists because silence alone could not contain it indefinitely. What happened in 1990 did not fit within any framework I was trained to apply, and so it remained outside record, outside discussion, outside belief. That exclusion was appropriate. Some events lose coherence when exposed to scrutiny. They persist only when left largely intact. I have avoided revisiting the details deliberately, knowing that repetition alters emphasis. Each retelling sharpens certain edges and dulls others, creating a version that never quite matches the original alignment. The truth of the incident did not reside in what occurred, but in how little occurred. There was no chase, no confrontation, no revelation. The absence of spectacle was the defining feature. It is also the reason the event endures without distortion. The entity, if such a term can be used at all, never demanded recognition in any explicit way. It did not announce itself, threaten us, or pursue explanation. It behaved as though our presence was an anomaly to be corrected, not an adversary to be defeated. Once corrected, the matter concluded. The restraint shown that night remains the most persuasive evidence of intelligence I encountered. Instinct escalates. Intelligence waits. I have never been asked formally to testify about the incident, and I have never volunteered to do so. Institutions function by categorization, and this account resists category. It cannot be archived without distortion, nor dismissed without residue. Leaving it unfiled has preserved its accuracy more effectively than any official process could have. What remains undocumented remains stable. The land itself no longer occupies my thoughts in any geographical sense. I do not imagine it changed or ruined. I imagine it restored to a condition that never included us. That perspective has altered how I understand human presence more broadly. We move through places assuming continuity belongs to us. Sometimes it does not. Sometimes it is merely tolerated until noticed. I have come to accept that the fear associated with such encounters is not fear of harm, but fear of displacement. Violence implies engagement. Displacement implies irrelevance. To be removed without struggle is to learn that one's presence was never essential. That lesson, once learned, does not fade. It reshapes how one stands in the world. This account will likely be dismissed by those who encounter it, if it is encountered at all. That dismissal is not failure. It is confirmation. The incident was never meant to convince. It was meant to correct a brief misalignment and then recede. Everything that followed, including this writing, is secondary to that purpose. I no longer seek meaning in what occurred, because meaning suggests intention directed toward us. The intention was directed toward balance. We were incidental to that process. Recognizing this has brought a form of clarity that explanation never could. Clarity does not comfort. It instructs. I live now within boundaries I did not choose and do not resent. They have kept the silence where it belongs and preserved distance where distance was required. I have not been troubled since I learned to comply. Compliance, in this case, was not surrender. It was understanding. I record this not to warn, but to leave a trace that will likely be ignored, as all accurate traces are. Some things remain stable only when overlooked. This account, like the land it describes, was never meant to be occupied for long. The night the Yowie returned was not the moment something came back to us, but the moment we learned, quietly and permanently, that we had never been alone there at all. I did not intend to add to this record after setting down what I believed would be its final line. Yet time has a way of revealing whether an account has truly settled or merely paused. In the years since I last wrote, nothing has contradicted what I understood then. That absence of contradiction, more than any new event, has compelled this addendum. Stability, when sustained long enough, becomes its own form of confirmation. There has been no return of correspondence, no further signs that attention has shifted again. The quiet has remained unbroken, not in the fragile way of vigilance, but in the steady way of equilibrium. I no longer sense alignment at random intervals. I no longer feel measured when crossing certain thresholds. This change did not occur suddenly. It arrived gradually, as though distance itself had finally been accepted on both sides without need for reinforcement. I recognize now that my earlier awareness functioned as a temporary condition rather than a permanent mark. Awareness was required only while misalignment persisted. Once behavior adjusted fully, the condition relaxed. This suggests that recognition was not meant to endure indefinitely. It was meant to correct, not to burden. That understanding reframes the entire experience in a way I did not grasp at the time. I have returned, cautiously, to environments I once avoided. Not the original region, and not places marked by deep neglect, but ordinary rural spaces where human use remains continuous. In these settings, sound behaves normally. Space feels neutral again. I do not mistake this for safety regained. I understand it as permission restored through compliance. Boundaries respected no longer need enforcement. This does not mean the original conditions no longer exist. It means they no longer require my attention. The distinction is important. Absence of awareness does not imply absence of presence. It implies separation maintained without effort. That outcome represents the most stable resolution possible. Anything more would have indicated imbalance. I have not shared this understanding with anyone, nor do I plan to. It is not transferable, and it would not survive explanation. What matters is not that it be known, but that it remain accurate. Accuracy, in this case, depends on restraint. To say more would be to risk drawing focus back to something that has returned to its own continuity. If this account is ever read beyond its author, it should be understood as incomplete by design. Completion would imply closure, and closure would imply finality. The incident never required either. It required only adjustment, which was achieved. Nothing further was asked. Nothing further occurred. I consider now that the greatest error humans make when encountering the unfamiliar is assuming it seeks engagement. Some things do not. Some things seek only restoration of balance, accomplished through minimal intervention. Once achieved, they withdraw from relevance entirely. That withdrawal is not defeat or disappearance. It is continuity uninterrupted. I am content to let this record end here, not because there is nothing more to say, but because nothing more is needed. The absence of further incident has said enough. What returned that night did not linger. It did not follow. It did not remain interested. It corrected a condition and resumed its own existence without regard for ours. This final edition will remain with the rest of the account, unfiled and unrequested. It does not change what was written before it. It only confirms that silence, once restored, can persist indefinitely when left undisturbed. I have reached the end of what can be written without altering the nature of the account itself. Any further detail would not clarify what occurred, it would only invite interpretation, and interpretation was never part of the exchange. What happened on that farm in 1990 concluded the moment balance was restored. Everything since has been residue, behavior shaped quietly by recognition rather than memory. I no longer frame the event as an encounter. That word implies mutual engagement. What occurred was closer to acknowledgement, brief and sufficient, after which separation resumed. The land did not change. We did. That asymmetry is essential. It explains why the incident resists narrative structure and why it cannot be revisited without distortion. Stories require progression. This required only correction. The disappearance, the abandonment, and the erasure were not outcomes to be investigated. They were mechanisms through which alignment was achieved. Once achieved, no further action was necessary. The absence of repetition is not evidence of rarity. It is evidence of success. Systems that function do not announce themselves. I have lived long enough now to understand that not all boundaries are drawn for protection. Some exist to ensure continuity for things that do not need us and never did. When those boundaries are crossed unintentionally, the response is not anger or violence. It is removal, clean, restrained, and final. That response teaches nothing except position. This record will likely remain unread or dismissed if found. That is appropriate. It was never meant to warn or convince. It exists only because one witness remained long enough to notice the correction taking place and understood that noticing was itself part of the misalignment. Writing it down is the last act of withdrawal. I no longer feel watched, measured, or considered. That absence is the final confirmation. Whatever return did so briefly, deliberately, and without need for recognition beyond that moment. Once recognition occurred, it resumed its own continuity and released us from relevance. The farm remains where it always was. The land did not follow us. It did not need to. We left behind more than fences and buildings. We left behind the assumption that the ground beneath us required our presence to exist. That night was not when something entered the world again. It was when we understood, too late and without ceremony, that we had been standing for years in a place that was never empty.